Good afternoon and welcome to the 2017 March webinar for the Spring Hydrologic Outlook. This is Chris Foltz from the National Weather Service, Central Region Headquarters. Today's briefing will be a general overview of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Mississippi Basin, including the Red River of the North and the Great Lakes drainages. Additional information and forecasts can be found online at www.weather.gov. Today's presenters are Steve Buin from the North Central River Forecast Center, who will provide an overview of current conditions, Jim Knoll from the Ohio River Forecast Center, Brian Connolly from the North Central River Forecast Center, Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, James Paul from the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center, and Jeff Grushel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. This webinar is being recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how to access the recording. A PDF version of these slides being used for today's briefing were sent out prior to this webinar. If you do encounter difficulties with the GoToWebinar, please utilize the PDF file. All questions will be held until the end of the webinar. If you happen to have a question during the webinar, please type it into the question box on the GoToWebinar GUI. Let's go ahead and begin with our first presenter, Steve Buin.
All right, thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess this is a hydrologic outlook, and by what we mean by that is that we'll be looking at both ends of the hydrologic spectrum, in that what are our chances for flooding this spring due to snowmelt and rain, but also what are the chances to go in the other direction, looking at where drought may impact the Mississippi Basin and Hudson Bay and Great Lakes drainages. So keep that in mind as we're going through the presentation. Looking at what has happened, this is the second of our spring hydrologic outlooks. We talked 2 weeks ago. Some of you may have been on that call, and at that time we were looking at winter precipitation over much of the Mississippi drainage and Hudson Bay and Great Lakes being at or above normal, with the exception at that time being an area centered around Missouri of being below normal. Since that time, over the last 2 weeks, we've seen a little more scattered picture of that, but a continuation of above normal precipitation across portions of the northern tier of states, including Wyoming, Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, into Michigan. But areas that have dried out would be the northern plains, including the Hudson Bay drainage, and that broad swath of the country from the Rockies over to the Appalachians, which will be important as we talk a little bit about how drought is evolving in the central part of the country. One area that is at this time seeing a little bit above normal precipitation is that Texas-Oklahoma region, where it's helped a little bit tamp down the drought, but still it would require much more to get things going in the wet direction, and we'll see that shortly. The big news, though, over the last 2 weeks has been that record warmth across much of the northern half of the country. As you can see in the outline of the Mississippi Basin there, all the colors are brown or red, indicating above normal temperatures have been experienced for the 2-week period from the 12th to the 28th across the entire area, including the Hudson Bay drainages and the Great Lakes. Prior to the winter had seen kind of that northwest section of Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas had seen below normal temperatures, but now in the last 2 weeks we've seen that replaced with above normal temperatures. And this fact of seeing above normal temperatures over the bulk of this area for much of the winter, and now as we transition into the early spring, has some significant ramifications for the hydrologic cycle, which we will talk about in a couple slides in general, but really we'll get into it in detail as we go basin by basin. So the first thing that's been impacted by those warm temperatures is that winter snowpack, and it has really been pushed far to the north, now just residing in the northern portion, really, of the northern tier states from Montana to Michigan. There's been a little bit of snow in the Wyoming and South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota area with a storm system that came through just a couple days ago, but that area was free of snow prior to that. So really, the winter snowpack has been pushed well to the north. The soil moisture picture hasn't changed a whole lot from what we saw 2 weeks ago. Again, there's a very sharp cutoff across Iowa between areas that have ample soil moisture and areas that are in a deficit. region. Again, this is going to be very important for water resource managers looking forward about when we may tip from that potential for spring flooding to where we would be having a water supply issue. So something to really keep in the back of your head, that this area of dryness in the south central part of the country is very important for the broader Midwest and the Mississippi drainage. The drought monitor from 2 weeks ago did show that drought is expanding in the central part of the country. We've seen the area in Missouri, the expansion of the moderate drought area, and we're seeing the expansion just in general of abnormally dry moving eastward into Illinois and Indiana. The drought really would not be able to move further north until we start to see more of a precipitation deficit. As you remember from the previous slide on the soil moisture, northern Iowa and southern Minnesota has excess soil moisture. So this drought can kind of move west and east at this time, but probably will not see it move too much further to the north. And again, some of these areas are starting to expand and get worse as far as like the Tennessee Valley and portions of the Cumberland. So something to really keep in mind. And we'll explain somewhat why some of this is happening with in a slide or two. The stream flow conditions are reflecting a couple things that are going on. We're starting to see more gauges from the USGS come online as that ice region retreats, as these streams open up. Their ice covers leaving very early in northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So gauges are coming back online, and they're having much higher stream flow than what we would be seeing normally at this time of the year because of the early melt. We've also seen a little bit of a pickup in stream flow to above normal in the upper Ohio Valley due to just a very recent rain system that was fairly significant in that area, and Jim Knoll will touch on that here in a few slides. Looking forward here for the next week or so, we're not expecting any major weather systems to impact the broader Mississippi Basin and Great Lakes. Yeah, we see a little bit of blue and some purple in the Great Lakes and the eastern Mississippi Basin, but that was from a storm system that's just exiting. We're really not going to be seeing much here in the next 6 days going forward. What we are expecting, though, in the week 2 is for there to be another resurgence of the warmth back into the broader Mississippi Valley and pushing all the way up into southern Canada. Accompanying with that, we're seeing another better chances to see drier than normal weather across the western central plains, with maybe a little bit of a chance for some northern weather systems that would be coming through with not a whole lot of moisture. So it's tilted towards seeing maybe above normal precipitation in the northern tier states, but the amount of moisture with that would be coming from the Pacific rather than Gulf moisture coming to the north. So quantity there would be limited. Our March outlook, though, now we're seeing kind of a big change from what we were looking at 2 weeks ago. We're really looking for temperatures to be above normal, a pretty high probability of that in the southern plains, into the central Mississippi Valley, and extending up even into the Great Lakes region and portions of the northern Mississippi Valley. That's quite a marked difference if you look at the small thumbnail where it says prior outlook in the upper left, where we were expecting maybe better than even chances of seeing below average temperatures in the northwestern portion of the basin and part of the Hudson Bay ranges. Now that's been replaced with equal chances. So a definite change in the temperature outlook, and even in the precipitation outlook, that area of drier than normal chances of increasing in the central plains and southern plains, and maybe a little increase in the precipitation chances in the Great Lakes region. The March through May outlook has not been updated from what we presented 2 weeks ago. Again, looking at probably a better than odd even chance of seeing warmer, and then a little bit maybe wetter in the northern plains into the western lakes. But so to kind of bring it up here with a few concluding remarks before we go into the individual basins, the flood control reservoir storage availability remains near maximum levels as it was 2 weeks ago. There really has not been any excessive rainfall or runoff in areas that have the flood control reservoirs, therefore their storage availability remains. The drought does persist in the central and southern plains and Central Valley. It has grown a little bit in the central Mississippi Valley, but a little bit of improvement in Oklahoma. We'll get into the details of that. And here's a really big factor that we think is starting to gain some relevance here, and that we've seen in the spring leaf index a 2 to 3 week acceleration from normal. And what that means to the hydrologic cycle is that as these plants are coming out of dormancy, they're starting to use soil moisture, and that they're using it 2 to 3 weeks in advance. So their demand on the system is drying out the soil. If we're not getting the spring rains to start, that's going to necessarily start to accelerate that drying of the soil and the drought conditions setting in. And right now this extends from Oklahoma City to kind of the St. Louis area to Columbus, Ohio. If that continues to push north, that will have ramifications for water supply, and what if we'll see the stream flow sustained past this initial pulse of spring runoff. So a very important consideration to keep in mind here for water resource managers as we move into spring and early summer. And now I'll turn it over to Jim Knoll at the Ohio River Forecast Center.
All right, thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. Not much has changed in the Ohio Valley over the last 2 weeks. The biggest change would be is instead of having just a little snowpack in the upper headwaters, we now have no snowpack or no ice or anything in the Ohio Basin. We did have a rather significant rainfall event cut right through the middle of the basin up the Ohio River in the last couple of days, dropping 1 to 3 to 4 inches of rain that has enhanced the stream flow conditions that Steve talked about in portions of the upper Ohio River Basin, but that's usually short-lived. And we do have some scattered minor flooding currently ongoing in the Ohio Basin, but again, nothing significant. Going forward now through the months of March, April, and May, we do expect near normal flood risk across the Ohio River Basin, and that's kind of what's shown on that graphic there. In Illinois, we're expecting some minor flooding in the Little Wabash Basin. And then in Indiana, in the Wabash and White River Basins, we are expecting some minor flooding. Again, that's very typical for the springtime season. Over in Ohio, we're expecting some minor floods on the Maumee and the Muskingum Basins in the typical spots that flood, and just below the 50% chance of minor flooding in portions of the Great Lakes and Miami River Basins in the state of Ohio. Further to the south of the Ohio River in the state of Kentucky, we are expecting some minor floods in portions of the Green and Kentucky River Basins, as well as the upper Cumberland Basin, but again, nothing out of the ordinary. Sometimes in the month of March and April, you can even get some moderate flooding in the Kentucky River Basin, and this year we're not even seeing that, so only minor flooding at the 50% chance level. So if we move on to the next slide then, what we're going to be expecting over the next couple of weeks is we do have a little bit more of an active weather pattern to bring at least some short-term rainfall to the Ohio River Basin. But again, the areas that you see in blue there, which is most of the area, that's generally close to 2 inches, which is about a normal rainfall for the Ohio River Basin for the 2-week period now as we move through the month of March. There could be some smaller areas, especially south of the Ohio River, that get over 2 inches. But again, overall, nothing really significant that is being indicated at this time. Moving on to the next slide, this is what we showed a couple of weeks ago. This is a total volume of water coming out of the lower Ohio River at Smithland. And the green solid line is what we consider normal flow for the lower Ohio River Basin. And that usually peaks around the middle of March, March 15th, March 20th, over 300,000 cubic feet per second of water. And what this shows is that recent rain, what we just had in the last couple of days, we do have a bump coming down the Ohio, but again, it's really just slightly above normal. And then we kind of retrace to very close to where that red line is, which is our average forecast, really out to the middle of April. And so what it's indicating is that really will have pretty close to normal stream flow conditions as a total volume for the Ohio Basin. Within the Ohio Basin, there will be some uncertainty, of course, where some places will be a little wetter and some places a little drier. So finally, if we go on to the last slide here, we'll kind of bring it all together. And again, not much has changed. We are expecting minor flooding across portions of the Ohio River Basin for this spring flood outlook period. This flood risk is considered very close to normal. But again, we're not even seeing any risk of moderate floods. We can't rule out a few just because it might be at the 10% chance level. But again, we're not really expecting anything outside right now of the minor flood category. So again, overall, the flood risk then is considered near normal for the Ohio Valley for this spring. One thing that should be noted that Steve was talking about in terms of this as a hydrologic outlook, there's still some lingering dryness and drought in portions of Tennessee. And like in this recent storm, they did get missed really with the majority of that heavier rain. And so there is that lingering dryness down there. So we are classifying, because the Army Corps of Engineers total storage capacity, they have a lot available down in the Cumberland River Basin. So we consider that to be below normal flood risk in the Cumberland Basin downstream of Wolf Creek Dam. And again, the only thing that's really going to drive the flood risk from here on out will be rainfall and thunderstorms, as we really don't have anything to worry about in terms of snow or ice. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and now turn it up to Brian Connolly at the North Central River Forecast Center to take a look at the upper Mississippi Valley and the surrounding areas.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I'm going to start out by revisiting the snow maps that Steve showed a little earlier. In the upper left here, I've got a snow map from February 12th. And in the lower right, I've got a snow map from February 26th. These are from the Office of Water Prediction National Operational Hydrologic Remote Sensing Center models. What I wanted to point out here is a couple things. First, if you look up in northern North Dakota and northwestern Minnesota, there hasn't been a lot of change in the amount of snow in the system up in those areas since the last outlook. So what we're going to see there is that the hydrologic outlook hasn't changed much in those areas, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The other thing I wanted to point out was how far north the snow line has moved. So on the 12th, you could see that the kind of the edge of the red colors there extended down into central Minnesota and even down into southern Wisconsin. But as of the 26th, most of that snow has gone due to the warm temperatures that we were experiencing. So as a result, we've already fired up our operational flood forecasting for the rain and the snow melt that has occurred during the last couple of weeks. So what we're showing here is even up in the Red River Valley, we've got some minor flooding going on along the Red River at the north, along the North Dakota-Minnesota border. And we've also got, from runoff that occurred in southern Minnesota and Wisconsin and northern Illinois, we have a flooding, minor to moderate flooding forecast for the main stem Mississippi. In fact, I think we're about 3 to 4 weeks early on starting our navigation forecasts from Guttenberg up to the Twin Cities due to this early snowmelt. This map shows our simulated water equivalent ranking compared to our period of record, which goes back to 1948. And here I just want to point out that we're still up in the upper quartile for simulated water equivalents in the Souris, Devil's Lake, and northern Red River of the North basins in North Dakota and northwestern Minnesota. So this demonstrates the magnitude of that snowpack that still exists. I also want to point out too that the headwaters of the Mississippi still has a fair snowpack. So moving into the outlook, so these maps are showing the flood category associated with the 50% exceedance probability flood for the upper Mississippi Basin. We have an above normal flood risk for the headwaters of the Mississippi, where we still do have some snowpack left to melt. However, through the rest of the Mississippi Basin, we're really looking at a normal flood risk. And what you see there for categories ranging from the 50% chance of no flooding to moderate flooding, that's kind of what we would normally see during that March to May time frame for flooding. I do want to add, though, that from those areas where we had the snow melting that had melted in central and southern Minnesota, much of Wisconsin, in those areas, we are looking at a reduced chance of seeing the big flood events that have occurred in the past, simply because we've lost a lot of the snow cover that we would normally have this time of year. For the Great Lakes Basin, we're really looking at a normal flood risk over most of this area, except for the Arrowhead of Minnesota, where we do have a slightly above normal flood risk, but even given that, we're not expecting even minor flooding in that area. Finally, in the Hudson Bay Basin, here we are seeing a much above normal flood risk for the Souris and northern Red River of the North Basins because of the wet antecedent conditions and the heavy snowpack in those areas. Also, Devil's Lake, which is a closed basin up between the Souris and the Red River of the North, has a much above normal flood risk. That lake has risen 27 feet since 1993, and we're looking at over a 2-foot rise being likely for this coming season. There's nearly a 20% chance of setting a new record for this lake as well. Finally, in the southern part of the Red River of the North Basin, there's a slightly above normal flood risk. Here we're looking at the chance for minor flooding. A lot of that is due to rain events that we're expecting in April and May, pretty normal for that time of year, that could dry the river up again. And here too, since the snowpack has diminished significantly in this area, the chances for a really big flood event have been reduced since the last outlook. We want to talk a little bit about the frozen ground conditions. Frost depths up in the northern tier of states in North Dakota, northern Minnesota, and Wisconsin are generally below normal at this time, between 8 and 20 inches. We're really not looking for frozen ground to be a big factor this spring. In terms of ice jam threats, the map on the right was taken on February 25th, and it's depicting the percent ice cover along the Mississippi from Minneapolis down to Guttenberg. The more blue you see, the more open water there is. Where you see red areas, there's still some ice cover. So we're mostly in an open water situation, not expecting big ice jams to be occurring along that stretch of the river. However, on the left, in the upper Mississippi, upstream of Minneapolis, we are seeing still significant ice cover up in the headwaters area, so we could still see some ice jams up in that part of the river basin. Also in the Red River of the North, up in that northern part, we still have an ice cover in place that could lead to some ice jams. So in summary, we're looking at an above normal to much above normal flood risk in northern North Dakota and northern Minnesota, including the Souris, Devil's Lake, and northern Red River of the North, and including the Mississippi Headwaters Basin. So moderate to major flooding is possible in these areas. Elsewhere in the rest of the upper Mississippi Basin and the Great Lakes Basin, we're really looking at near normal flood risk for those areas, and normal to below normal ice jamming and frozen ground potential across the region. So with that, I'll pass it on to Kevin Lau with the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Brian. Again, I'm Kevin, and I'll be speaking about the conditions in the Missouri Basin and the flood potential there. So flood risk relative to normal varies across the Missouri Basin this spring. Generally speaking, we have a near normal risk for flooding over much of the basin, as indicated on this graphic by the white dots. White means that the runoff potential for this year compares well with normal conditions. Cooler colors, the blues and the greens, indicate locations where there's a decreased risk for flooding as compared to normal. Hot colors, the pinks and oranges and reds, indicate locations which have an enhanced risk for flooding as compared with normal. Now, mind you, by itself, this graphic doesn't indicate whether flooding is actually projected for any of these locations. I'll discuss that later on in my presentation. But so this graphic, where it doesn't tell you whether or not a given location will flood, it does show those locations that have a marked increase or decrease in the chance of reaching flood stage. So, for instance, there are areas in the Dakotas and northwest Iowa that have an increased chance for higher than normal flows, as do a few of the mountain streams out in the west. On the flip side, the area of eastern Kansas, southwest Nebraska, and the entire state of Missouri has generally a reduced risk of high flows this coming spring. And that would agree with the abnormally dry conditions in the lower portion of the basin that Steve has already alluded to. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk about the mountains. The left-hand plot shows the mountainous basin snowpack conditions in percent of normal snow water equivalent. Mountain snowpack can generally be categorized this year as being somewhat above normal. For the Missouri Basin above Fort Peck, we are near normal. The Yellowstone, North Platte, and South Platte are all a bit above normal as far as snowpack conditions go. On the right-hand side of this slide is a depiction of the February water supply forecast that was issued by our office about 4 weeks ago. The March update is expected to come out next week and can be accessed off our website. Preliminary numbers for the March update suggest that or project near average mountain runoff for the upper Missouri above Fort Peck, slightly higher than average for the Yellowstone and North Platte basins, and a below normal runoff year for the South Platte basin. Now we'll go to the next slide, and as Steve and Brian have already alluded to, I'll need to talk a bit about the plains snowpack. As was already mentioned, unseasonably warm temperatures in the second half of February eroded much of the Dakota's snowpack in the Missouri Basin. But then a late February winter event laid another 1 to 2 inches of snow water equivalent, stretching from Wyoming through northern Nebraska and into northern Iowa. So plains snowpack is fairly widespread at this time, but generally shallow. So for the next few slides, I'm going to go basin by basin and give the actual flood projections. So for this first slide, flooding has already occurred in Montana and Wyoming, but it has always been associated with river ice action. In fact, the Bighorn River at Basin, Wyoming, provisionally set a new record stage due to ice jamming this past month. Widespread significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone is not expected this year, but we are expecting minor flooding in some of the tributaries, such as in the Sun River and Clear Creek in northern and western Montana, and the Clark's Fork Yellowstone in southern Montana. We also expect minor to possibly moderate flooding in the Wind River Basin in Wyoming. With the next slide, we'll move to the northern plains within the Missouri Basin. As mentioned before, we have eroded much of the Dakota's snowpack here recently in the past couple of weeks. However, we did not see the amount of runoff that we would have expected to see from the loss of snow. And possibly there was a combination of the sublimation of the snow due to the wind, infiltration into the ground, or water being stored in surface depressions. But at any rate, we did not see the hydrologic response from the loss of snow that we thought we would. And so some of our earlier projections have been lowered. In North Dakota, we still project minor flooding along the Cannonball and the Little Muddy rivers, and moderate flooding in the headwaters of the James River Basin. In South Dakota, we've already experienced flooding along the White River due to snow melt aggravated by river ice action. The James River at Columbia rose above minor flood stage last week due to earlier meltout of the Elm River Basin. Minor flooding remains possible along the White, the Big Sioux, and the James River for this coming spring. In Nebraska, minor flooding is likely along the lower reach of the North Platte River and along some of the smaller tributaries such as the Salt in eastern Nebraska. Due to high North Platte and South Platte headwater snowpack and current reservoir conditions, the Platte River below North Platte in the central portion of the state remains a concern for this spring. Our long-range river models do not indicate the likelihood of flooding, but we will continue to monitor the Platte River in central Nebraska closely, as things could and often do change. Finally, with the next slide, we will look at the lower portion of the Missouri Basin in the states of Kansas and Missouri. As we showed in our first slide, abnormally low soil moisture conditions have rendered an overall decrease in the chance for flooding in this area as compared against normal. However, even with that said, we do expect flooding, in other words, a better than a 50-50 chance, in eastern Kansas and across the state of Missouri. Thunderstorm activity drives springtime flooding in the southern part of the basin. Moderate level flooding is likely in the Grand River Basin and along the Tarkio River in Missouri. Moderate flooding is also possible along Stranger Creek in eastern Kansas. Minor flooding is likely in the southern portion of the Blue River Basin in Kansas and in the Osage River Basin in both Kansas and Missouri. Minor flooding is expected in the Platte River in Missouri and the Sheraton River, and along many of the smaller streams feeding the Missouri River in Missouri. Finally, the Missouri River below Nebraska City may also have a few locations which will exceed minor flood stage this spring, but again, this is not atypical. And so then in summary, we do have somewhat greater than normal snowpack in the mountains, and a few of the tributaries in the mountainous west have been identified as likely having minor flooding this spring. Plains snowpack has some heavy spots, but is generally shallow. Soils are probably wetter than normal in parts of Montana, North Dakota, extreme eastern South Dakota, and northwest Iowa. And thunderstorm activity is the primary driver in the lower portion of the basin, and we do expect flooding possible across much of the eastern portion of the Missouri Basin this spring. Thank you. This concludes the Missouri Basin Flood Potential Brief, and I'll pass you along to James with the Arkansas Red.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. Not much has changed in the ABRFC area in the past 2 weeks. We did get a couple of storm systems roll through that dropped up to 2 inches of rain locally, but did not produce any flooding. The two areas highlighted in the image highlighted in this image show the locations in the past 2 weeks that have received above normal precipitation. However, if you look at longer time frames of 30, 60, 90 plus days, most of the basin is still below normal with respect to precipitation. This was depicted pretty good by the drought graphic that Steve showed earlier. For the next slide, this image shows the NRCS snow water equivalent for the upper Arkansas. A couple weeks ago, it was about 150% of normal. With the lack of additional snow these past 2 weeks, that percentage has dropped to about 115% of normal. Again, most of the snowpack is in the higher elevations along our border near the headwaters of the Arkansas River, with very little to no snow cover in far southeast Colorado. We are not expecting an increased risk of flooding due to snowmelt, which for the Arkansas River headwaters typically occurs in early June. Next slide, please. Here we are showing the current flood pool storage availability in the Corps and Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs within our basin, with the exception of one lake in southeast Oklahoma at 84% availability. Almost all of the rest of the reservoirs have their entire flood pool storage available, or at least 95%, with most being 99 to 100% available. They're all in good shape to capture any excessive runoff we may see from spring storms we get. And my final slide shows our long-range outlook map And if you look closely, you'll notice a few more points, locations with a greater than 50% chance of minor flooding than were shown in the image from 2 weeks ago. This is mainly because this product has with its 90-day outlook now includes the last 2 weeks of May, which for the eastern part of our area historically has a higher probability of flooding, so we're now including that time frame in this map as opposed to 2 weeks ago. And even though much of the basin is still in some sort of drought, we can and do get flooding during these times, and any flooding we do get will come from springtime thunderstorm systems that do occur. And with all that being said, the ABRFC is looking at a near normal flood risk for the entire basin. Next, we'll go to Jeff at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
Alrighty, thank you, James. Just looking at the soil moisture conditions for our area, we still have very dry conditions over the northeast parts of Texas, portions of Arkansas and southern Missouri. Drought conditions that will continue over this area. Also in the western parts of North Carolina, we've had long-term droughts for over 6 months in that area. That has lessened some, but we continue to have dry conditions for both of those locations that are circled in red. As James had mentioned earlier, we'd had a couple inches of rainfall that had fallen over portions of Arkansas and Tennessee and has helped, at least in a short term, help some of the soil moisture conditions in those areas. But overall, we're still fairly dry across the LMRC area for this time of year. And next slide. Just like what others had said about flood storage availability, all of the reservoirs that we have across the LMRC area can handle any sort of rainfall that we typically would have this time of year. In fact, the areas in southern Missouri and northwestern parts of Arkansas actually have not even made conservation pools, so there's several feet of additional storage in those areas that we typically don't have for this time of year. So everything is in good shape for being able to at least store any water that we may have falling above these particular reservoirs. Next slide. As far as the stream flow conditions, 2 weeks ago, we really didn't have a lot of areas that were showing in the much below or low category. And because of the rainfall the lack of rainfall that we haven't had over the last few weeks, that area of much below to low has really expanded over Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee over the last 2 weeks. And so, and a good part of that is what Steve had mentioned with the spring leaf index. Everything is pretty much blooming in our area now, so everything, the runoff that we typically, surface runoff that we would typically get with rainfall is really being absorbed a little bit and not getting as much of a runoff aspect in causing our rivers to go up, not quite as much as what we typically have this time of year. So if we can continue to have really dry conditions here over the next several weeks, really the flood chances for our area are going to be significantly reduced. Next slide. So finally, take into account everything that's going on the red in Missouri and upper part of the Mississippi and Ohio, we're really expecting just a normal flood risk for the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers. Again, even with the normal risk, we can get minor flooding at a couple of locations with any sort of convective spring rains, but really that's pretty typical for our area. There is a reduced risk of flood across the black and white basins that are in the southern Missouri, northern Arkansas area, and then also in the Tennessee Valley. Just because of the drought conditions there, the flood risk there again will be below normal. Again, though, with any of our areas that you're seeing in orange or red, any typical convective rainfall that we have in the springtime can produce some minor and in some cases some moderate flooding, but really the risk is pretty seasonal and normal for this time of year. And that's all I had from our area, and I'll switch it over to Steve.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So with the summary here being that basically gradating from north to south at above normal risk in the very, very northern part of the United States, and really as we move south, it goes down to near normal. But again, as you heard from each of the basin presenters, is that they're really close to going over to a condition of the dryness and limiting the amount of runoff. So that is really something that that we will be monitoring and bringing hydrologic outlooks or drought outlooks as the season moves on here. So I'm going to turn it back over to the moderator, Chris, and who will take your questions.
All right, thanks, Steve, and thanks also to Jim and Brian, Kevin, James, and Jeff for the presentations on the respective basins. At this time, we don't have any questions that have been entered into the question box, so I'm going to pause here for just about 30 seconds. If anybody's got a last-minute question that they would like to throw out there for one of the gentlemen on the call, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I do want to go ahead and thank you for participating on today's webinar. As mentioned, this is the last webinar for this spring. Certainly, we could have an additional briefing scheduled if things change significantly, but at this time, it doesn't appear that that will be the case. Another reminder that this was recorded. I'll put that together and hopefully get that out to folks over the weekend or first part of next week. Link to where you can view this recording online, or for those that weren't able to make it, to give them the opportunity to view the briefing. Just as another reminder, there are additional information and forecasts that are available on weather.gov, and I still see no questions. So at this point, I think we'll go ahead and conclude the briefing for today. I want to thank you everybody for participating, and I wish you a good afternoon.